All right. So what we're going to do in this video, this part of the beginner's guide, is talk about basic object creation, a little bit of working with those objects, along with diving into the object manager and attribute manager a little bit more as well. We may end with a little bit of seeing some of the different modes that we can use, but if that's not covered in this video, it will make it into the next one, which will be more about modeling. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so at this point, we should know how to navigate, how to make some basic selections, as well as maybe have a general idea of how to create an object. And as I mentioned in the previous video, these are the majority of the different objects we can create. So we have spline primitives, mesh primitives, text objects, generators, volume objects, MoGraph objects, deformers, effectors, fields, stage objects, and lights. Okay, so there's a whole lot in there. We obviously won't get to all of them in this video, but what I do want to start with is our mesh primitives, since these probably are the most common type of geometry object you will create. So I'm going to go ahead and create a cube. We did this last video as well. Okay, now let's talk about our object manager here. Okay, we have the ability to work with layers, add to a layer, as well as pull up our layer manager, which can also be accessed right here. Well, we won't be getting into this right now. We then have our two stoplights here. So the top stoplight can be set to green, it can be set to red, and this corresponds to our viewport here, our perspective view, or really all of our viewports. So green means visible, red means not visible, and gray just means kind of default, which is visible. Okay, we'll talk more about the gray later on. It comes in handy more with hierarchies and parenting. The red stoplight deals with rendering. So same type of options here, gray, green, or red. Okay, now you will still see it in your perspective view, even if the bottom stoplight here is set to red. And while we are far off from actually rendering anything, you can do a quick render view and see that it's not there when the bottom stoplight is set to red. However, if I set it to gray or green, it will show up in our render. And so not only can you have things be visible here, but not render, you can also have objects not be visible in your perspective view, and they will still render. So that's a very powerful combination and is really important for organization. Now, as a primitive here, you can also turn an object on or off by hitting this checkbox here from green to the red X. Okay, and that just means on or off, and off will not render. I should also mention that if you double click on an object's name, you can name it. That is also very important. The last part of the object manager is this section over here. And this section contains all the different tags or additional properties we add to our objects. Now, those can be found right here. Okay, though you have to have something selected. Okay, so if I select my object, you will see all the different tags. Now, there are a variety of different purposes for these tags: animation, bullet tags, or simulation. There's some for camera, hair. I mean, you get the idea. So these allow us to add additional properties when we want to do more with these objects. And so some of these will be covered, and I already have videos about some of these. I already have videos about the align to spline, track modifier, believe maybe the vibrate tag as well. So, you can check out my channel for those videos. All right. But for right now, we don't need to worry about those. The tag that is on here is the Fong tag, and that's really not worth talking about on a cube. I will get to it when I create a sphere here very shortly. Okay, next up, I want to talk about our attribute manager. Now, just about every object is going to have a few of these same options here. So pretty much every object you will create has a basic tab, and a lot of this information can be found in other places, but it can also be found here. Things like the object's name, okay? Things like the layer, both of which are right there. Viewport visibility, render visibility, right? Our stoplights, enabled, right? That checkbox there. Okay, we can also change the display color if we want. Not something we need to really about right now, as well as X-ray, which kind of makes things a little bit transparent, which can be helpful for navigating and positioning things. Okay, we then have the coordinate tab, which I talked previously about, where we can access the position, rotation, and scale of our objects. Okay. And since this is a primitive object, there is an object tab where you can access its basic object properties. Now, you can only access these properties when this is primitive. If you were to make this editable and turn it into a straight polygon object, you will lose the ability to adjust the size, adjust the segments, and whatever other options you might have, because it does vary object to object. Usually, there are other ways to achieve these types of things. They can just be a little bit different, sometimes trickier. Okay. For instance, I can fill it, which rounds out the edges here. A really nice option. But I can do this several other ways as well by beveling edges or even using my bevel deformer. Okay. So that's a look at our object tag. And then you will also see we have our Fong tag, which is really just showing us this tag's properties. So that's what we're seeing in our attribute manager. Now, obviously don't have time to go through every single object. Okay. But I will create a sphere. Right? My recommendation is to kind of go through each object, take a look at the basic tab, coordinate tab, even though those really shouldn't change, but spend the majority of your time in the object tab. Okay. Because you will typically have properties to adjust for size, or in this case, radius, as well as segments. And these segments, if I turn my lines back on, become important for what we plan on doing with this object next. If we plan on doing anything else other than making it a primitive. Okay, so I can increase the number of segments, decrease it. In the case of this sphere, change the type from, say, hemisphere to hexasphere, which is really just four-sided. Okay, so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about the Fong tag here. The Fong tag smooths out our edges based on whatever angle we've defined here. So you'll notice the sides of the cube have a very hard edge, okay, in between them. Whereas our sphere here looks very smooth, and that's all due to our Fong tag. If I remove the Fong tag, notice how everything looks more faceted, and they're not trying to smooth out in between the different edges or segments. And so at this point, all you need to know about Fong is it can smooth objects, it can make them look faceted. All right. And I don't think I mentioned it on the cube, but it too has the ability to add segments. Okay. And once again, these segments can be helpful for, say, adding deformers and trying to, model this into a different shape. Okay, so that's kind of a look at our most common mesh primitives. Spline primitives are a bit different. Okay, spline primitives are consisted of lines and segments. Maybe even consider them edges. Okay, and these are really here to be used as something else. Splines or let's call them splines, aren't geometry. So if I render them, you won't see anything. So we can use them to create geometry, but they're not geometry on their own. They have their own section of generators for us to work with and create geometry from them, like extrude, lathe, loft, and sweep, as well as some others work as well. For instance, I can take in a rectangle and put it into an extrude, and I'm going to extrude or create depth from this shape. Now, I was actually just changing the width and height of the rectangle because I do want to spend a bit more time in there. I'll come back to the extrude, so I will turn it off. We can round this out, so similar to the fillet option we just saw, okay, and work with its orientation as well as its intermediate points type, which is something we don't really need to get into right now. Okay, turning back on that extrude, you will see it too has a basic tab. It too has a coordinates tab. Okay, and typically what you want to do is move the generator. Now, generators are green. Typically, that means they need a child. So that's why I put the rectangle spline here in the extrude. Okay, and so if I want to move an object, scale or rotate, I'm going to do that with the extrude and not the rectangle, unless, of course, I may be working with its object properties there. But a little bit of the basics of the extrude, you can offset it, give this object more depth. Okay, and then there's a cap section that allows you to round out the front and end of this, okay, or the start cap and end cap. You can also use different presets here. Okay, I have a whole separate video about the extrude, so check that out if you want to see more about that. But that is a little bit about our spline primitives, and they too will have different properties based on the different shape and whatever object type you are creating. Okay. And let's talk about deformers really quick. So we've talked about generators briefly. They're green. They typically need a parent to work. Deformers work really one of two ways, but the most common one is to make them a child of whatever you want them to affect. So I'm going to start with a cube, and I'm going to add a bend deformer to this. Now, not all of these work well for modeling. The majority of them do, but some, say for instance, the wind is probably more animation related. Okay, same with kind of explosion or explosion FX. They can certainly change your objects, and maybe that's all you need. But some of them do work better in different situations other than modeling. But let's start with a bend deformer. Okay. Deformers, as I mentioned, need to be made a child of whatever it is you want them to work on. So I can drag and drop my bend deformer here. Now, we did create just a simple hierarchy, just like we did with the extrude. I'll talk more about those here very shortly, but let's take a look at what we can do. Our deformers have the same basic tab, have the same coordinate tab, and have their own object properties. Now, in this case with the bend, it has different properties for size. We can change the size of this. Usually you want to do this before making it a child, but we can also just hit fit to parent in this case, and it's going to fit it very, very closely. Okay, a couple of different modes, and the strength. Now, what we're seeing here is that while the deformer itself is bending, our object isn't because it doesn't have those additional edges, those additional segments needed. So what I can do is go back to my cube, increase the segments on the y-axis, since that is the vertical axis, and notice now this is actually bending, it's deforming. And I want to be careful here because it still looks kind of faceted. I can see the individual kind of each angle or part of the bend. And as I turn that up, that will make it harder and harder to see that. Okay, so depending on how close we're going to get, how, how much more we're going to do to this, we may want to use more segments or less segments because of that. So that's a quick look at our deformers. And once again, experiment with them. Okay. Bulge is going to work the same way. Shear, taper, twist all work the same way. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about hierarchies. Okay. I'm going to take and create a cube, and I'm going to create a sphere and place this and move this sphere off to the side here. Okay. And just like I did previously, I can take my sphere and essentially drag and drop it onto the cube, which will make it a child. And that does a couple of different things. I can now select the cube, move it, and the sphere will come along with. The same would be true if I scaled it and if I rotated it. Okay. So I'll just move this off here. Okay. Notice when I select the cube, go to the coordinates tab, and zero it out, the cube goes back to the origin. Okay. Yeah. The sphere, though, still kind of retains its own properties. I can still move it, rotate it, scale it independently. Okay. But watch what happens as I select the sphere and zero it out. Okay. It now moves to the middle of the cube. And more precisely, it moves where the object axis of the cube is. So in essence, what happened is the sphere's origin now moved to wherever the cube's axis is. And so that is important to keep in mind. I'm going to zero out the rotation here because this also becomes important for determining which axis we're going to work on. Okay. And actually, I don't feel like getting into that right this second. So instead, let's just briefly talk about our different modes here. And then that will give me plenty of time to talk about modeling in the next video. So with any of your mesh primitives, okay, we have uh, the ability to make them editable. And that turns them from these primitive objects into polygon objects. And that opens the door to a whole bunch of additional tools and options for turning this shape, this object, into something we would like. Okay, and you can make something editable two ways by either hitting make editable or hitting C on the keyboard as it says there. So we can go ahead and do that. Now, once again, we have our basic tab, coordinate tab, but the object tab is gone. Long tag still there. Okay. Each polygon object is made up of points. Okay, so that's these guys right here. Okay. Edges, as well as polygons. Now, polygon is made up of 3 or more points. Okay, an edge connects 2 points, and our points are just what they are. And the only thing you need to take away from that is that the points give us the most control when it comes to manipulating them and moving them because it is the smallest kind of part of a polygon object we can work with. If I move an edge, I'm moving at least 2 points. If I'm moving a polygon, I am moving at least 4 points. And in this case, 4 edges. Okay. And all of that is very important when it comes to modeling. Now, I will end this video saying that if you right click with a polygon, with an edge or a point selected, you will see all the different tools and options we have. I shouldn't say all, the majority of the tools and options we have for working with this object, adding more detail to it, changing the shape, and all of that good stuff. And while I won't cover all of these tools in my next video, we will talk about the most common ones and where we might want to use them. So that will do it for this video. Let me know if there's anything else you would like to see, and take care.